Well, ladies and gentlemen, actually quite a lot to talk about today. And I must be honest and say it's one of the few times where I've actually read the news and thought to myself, I don't really know what to say because the level of retardation is just beyond the world. There's so much to talk about. I'm going to try to get through all of it. Some of it you may think like, why is this important? But bear with me, we'll get to it. So let's actually start off with the first news article. And this is that the ANC has condemned the DA's defense of the Israeli apartheid state and genocide. Now, I must admit, I read this entire press release issued by the ANC on the 22nd of September. And this obviously after Cyril Ramaphosa said that DA metros and municipalities were, well, the better run municipalities and metros in the country. Well, now the ANC is attempting to reverse that position by classing the DA as apartheid people. Anyway, we'll get to that. So apparently the ANC says they condemn the DA's defense and continued support of the state to Israel. Now that's in itself quite important because at the weekend, Helen Ziller was asked whether or not she feels that Israel's committing genocide. And she said, genocide is a big word. I'm not really prepared to comment on that, but she said that she supported a two-state solution. Now, according to the ANC, genocide has been proven because a UN inquiry headed by a South African judge, apparently in his own capacities and investigations, concluded that there was genocide. And so that means there's genocide, apparently. But the actual claims themselves have been heavily disputed, and it's important to recognize that underneath the Rome Statute and even underneath the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, there has actually been no ruling, no legal ruling, including the ICJ case that South Africa took against Israel. That was not findings of genocide. In fact, they said there is potentially a case, but there was no actual determination of genocide. So South Africa is throwing around the word genocide, as are many other Western countries, and one has to be careful because there hasn't actually been any proof of genocide yet. Now, according to the ANC, a number of states, amongst those Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Portugal, and Mexico, have recently recognized the state of Palestine. And this is all leading to support for a two-state solution. Now, it's important to recognize that a two-state solution has been on the table for pretty much some time, and this was all done underneath the Land for Peace agreements. But there is some contention here. We're going to get to that in a second. Now, the ANC says that they feel that they've been vindicated because of their case of genocide against Israel and the ICJ, obviously with some of these reports that have come out suggesting that genocide has been committed. So this all expanded because Ramaphosa is currently at a UN meeting, and he said that he welcomed the number of Western countries who are recognizing the state of Palestine. And he said South Africa welcomed this move. He said that he reiterated the firm commitment for the creation of the contentious Palestinian state, which he says will exist peacefully and side by side with the state of Israel along the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. All of that may not seem important, it really is. Now, Ramaphosa says that he condemned Hamas's October 7th attack, but he says that the response from Israel unleashed disproportionate violence on the people of Palestine. And he says that the reason that they're there today is that the only solution to the conflict is a two-state solution. Now, he said that Israel must comply with the collective obligations underneath international laws. And I did read this and think to myself, well, we've seen numerous instances where the ANC says that they cannot be pressurized by other countries, that their own internal sovereignty overrides anything anyone else has to say. We've seen this numerous times in relation to the US. Remember when US says that they shouldn't have BE or whatever other stuff, the ANC says very vehemently, they say, no, we are a sovereign nation, we'll do whatever we want. But now Israel must comply with the collective obligations underneath international law. I see how that works. So apparently this two-state solution will be global recognition of Palestine and its sovereignty and its territorial integrity, an immediate ceasefire and an end to the genocide and the release of hostages by Hamas and political prisoners by Israel. Now that's quite important because they're saying that all of the terrorists that have been captured by Israel for committing atrocities in Israel itself, those individuals are not terrorists, according to the ANC. They are political prisoners. Very interesting. Now, full respect for international law, including UN resolutions and opinions and decisions of the ICJ, must be abided to by Israel, removal of obstacles to the two-state solution, including a halt to illegal settlements and removal of the separation wall. So obviously the separation wall is the wall created between Gaza and Israel. Now it's important to recognize that there's one of those walls as well. They're in the south of the country with Egypt. And apparently there must be a restoration of humanitarian aid and reconstruction in Gaza. But one has to remember that if Israel is a sovereign state, it doesn't have to allow anybody to cross its borders and be in its territory, because that's what happens when you're a sovereign state. In any case, Ramaphosa says that this conflict has been going on since the UN was created. And he says that he's convinced that this recognition, the recognition of the state of Israel, is the only solution to allow Israel to live in peace. So let's actually get into the specifics, because you see the ANC sometimes not very good at the specifics. So remember we talked fundamentally about the 1967 lines, also known as the Green Lines. Well, the 1967 borders of Israel aren't technically the borders of Israel, so per se, because in 1949, after Israel's War of Independence, Israel signed an armistice agreement with Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Now, armistice lines were drawn on maps in green ink, hence why they're also called the Green Line Agreement. And these ultimately weren't official borders, but the armistice lines were pending a final peace settlement between the sides. Now, the idea ultimately, according to that agreement, was that the mandate of Palestine would be divided in 55% of the land would be Jewish states, 45% would be an Arab state, Jerusalem and Bethlehem would be an international zone under UN control. Now, the Jewish state would include the coastal plain, also known as Tel Aviv. It would include parts of the desert and parts of Galilee in the north. Now, the Arab state would include the West Bank Hill Country, the Gaza Strip, and parts of Galilee, and the central interior. Now, Jews actually accepted that plan despite leaving Jerusalem out, and the Arabs rejected it outright, which led to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which Israel declared independence on the 14th of May, 1948. Now, the Arab-Israeli War was actually neighboring Arab states who invaded into Israel, and the war actually ended with the Armistice Agreement of 1949. Now, underneath that agreement, Israel controlled 78% of the Palestinian Mandate, which was more than the 55% the UN had allotted. Now, Israel captured West Jerusalem, not the old city, and Jordan occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Now, Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights remained under Syria's control. Now, you see, not to be outdone, the Arab leagues were very unhappy with the amount of control that Israel had, which led to the Six-Day War, which was from June 5th to 10th, 1967. And what effectively happened in that war is that Egypt and Israel basically entered into a huge big barney over the Sinai Peninsula, which ultimately Israel won. But you see, in typical fashion, it wasn't just Israel against Egypt, it was Israel against, well, everyone, including Jordan and Syria, because Jordan shelled West Jerusalem and entered the war. And after Israel counterattacked, they captured East Jerusalem and the entire West Bank. In terms of the Golan Heights, well, after heavy debate, Israel attacked Syria's positions on June 9th and 10th, and by the end of that, Israel actually captured the Golan Heights overlooking northern Israel. So the actual result in the 6 days war was that Israel won and captured more land. They effectively captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. So what that effectively allowed Israel to do was triple its landmass. Now, the Arabs, being highly humiliated, fueled future conflicts, which led to the UN Resolution 242 of November 1976, which called Israel to withdraw from the territories occupied in exchange for peace. Now, Israel accepted in principle, but there were wording disputes which left ambiguity. Now, large populations of Palestinians for the first time actually came under Israeli control, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. As Israel had effectively annexed East Jerusalem, they declared Jerusalem as united and as its capital, although this hasn't actually been recognized internationally. Now, the Arab League's response were what's known as the three no's, which is no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel. So why do these 1967 borders matter? Well, when people talk about the 1967 borders, they usually mean a future two-state solution with Israel inside the Green Line and a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And they always draw reference to the UN Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967, which calls for Israel to withdraw from territories occupied in the recent conflict in exchange for peace. Now, it's important to recognize that because Palestine sees those 1967 lines as the basis for their independent state, but Israel sees them as indefensibly militaristically and instead argues for secure and recognized borders, which is the same language that they've been using since UN Resolution 242. So this argument over what is the actual territorial limit has been going on for some time. It's been going on since 1967. So one has to ask the question, what is the territory that's ultimately in dispute? Well, it will be East Jerusalem, because across the Israeli political divide, all parties, whether being left, center, or right, have a consensus. And that consensus is that Jerusalem must remain Israel's eternal and undivided capital. So there is no support for a two-state solution in Israel that endorses giving up the sovereignty over the Old City and the Temple Mount, also known as East Jerusalem. Because according to the Israeli government and the Israeli public, Jerusalem's not just land, it's about identity, history, and security. And so any form of compromise is just seen as politically toxic. But you see, the Palestinians insist that East Jerusalem must be their capital, and that without it, they will not consider any state as being viable. The Palestinian Authority rejects any deal that doesn't include East Jerusalem, and Hamas goes actually one step further to say, well, they will have no recognition of Israel, and they don't even want Israel to have their land. It must be all lands to Hamas, and no lands to the Jewish state.
Offers to make peace. We can't forget October 7th, can we? Now, as if to encourage continued conflict, some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities, including October 7th, even while they refuse to release the hostages or accept a ceasefire. Instead of giving to Hamas and giving so much, because they've taken so much, they have taken so much. This could have been solved so long ago. But instead of giving in to Hamas's ransom demands.
اليوم ليش كل الدول أعطيني بس أقول لك مثل ليش كل الدول أصبحت تعترف بفلسطين الآن؟ قبل 7 أكتوبر هل في دولة تجرأت على أن تعترف بدولة فلسطين؟ أعطيني بس مثال. الآن حصاد 7 أكتوبر هو الذي خلى كل العالم يفتح عيونه على القضية الفلسطينية.
But you see, there are problems with handing over East Jerusalem, and that is that Israel has expanded Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, and there are now roughly around 230,000 Jews who live in those areas. Israel maintains full security control and applies Israeli law across East Jerusalem, and the US, underneath Donald Trump, recognized Jerusalem, not explicitly east or west, as Israel's capital and moved its embassy there in 2018. So the question then is, what could the international community actually do about the Palestinian-Israel state, specifically with regards to who controls what? And this question itself is actually very difficult to determine because, you see, most countries already refuse to recognize Israel's sovereignty over East Jerusalem. They could go further by recognizing a state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital, even without the Israeli government's agreement, and some already have. Now, the UN General Assembly has passed many non-binding resolutions affirming East Jerusalem as being occupied. So when you hear the South African government or any of these individuals talking about the occupation of Palestine, they're talking about East Jerusalem, that's the Temple Mount. Now, the UN Security Council could pass a binding resolution demanding withdrawal, but the US veto makes that impossible as of right now. Now, that could change in the future, and given the way that the US has gone rather wacky-backy with many Democrats, that might change in the future. Now, the EU or UN members could impose economic sanctions, arms embargoes, or possible trade restrictions, all targeting Israel's presence in East Jerusalem. And there are numerous calls for that across the EU right now, with countries such as Spain. Now, they could impose similar sanctions, which were imposed against South Africa underneath apartheid. And the ICJ has issued an advisory opinion as of 2024 that Israel's occupation is unlawful and must end. So apparently, again, they're all targeting the illegal occupation of East Jerusalem. Now, it's important to remember why they have that. Remember, there was a war. They tried to destroy Israel. Israel captured land. Anyway, let's get back to it. Now, it's important to recognize that the ICJ rulings are not enforceable without Security Council backing, but again, these are constantly blocked by the US veto. So as long as Washington protects Israel diplomatically and militarily, the international community cannot force Israel in the traditional sense that they might have before. And even in the EU, whilst the EU is the biggest trading partner of Israel, it still struggles to unite around this idea of sanctions. Many East European countries often side with Israel and block EU consensus. They can't actually get a consensus on whether or not to sanction Israel.
There is no Palestinian state, no matter how many papers they put out. And the only time there'll ever be one is if there is a negotiation with Israel, which right now is impossible because they have a war going on with Hamas, a terrorist group that butchered over 2,000 people on October 7th, just almost 2 years ago. And so as long as that's going on, the whole thing is irrelevant. It's almost a vanity project for a couple of these world leaders who want to be relevant, but it really makes no difference. Now, I will say it actually, the impact it has had is it actually derailed, it made Hamas, talks that were going on, it made it even harder to get Hamas to enter into concessions that might have brought this to an end. And look, we think there's a window of opportunity right now to pursue it. The only leader in the world, really, that can sort of broker that or bring that together is President Trump. That's why every country in the region, and frankly, every country in the world, including many of those involved in this recognition effort, are begging the president to get involved in this issue.
Many Arab states like Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia have normalized or are moving towards normalization of trade with Israel. Though, whilst they publicly back the Palestinians, they kind of have to because it's like their brothers, they do prioritize trade with Israel against Iran, and so that weakens any form of collective pressure. So what does that actually mean for the so-called Palestinian state? Well, it's actually a very interesting question because there are now questions in Israel whether they should just fully annex the West Bank and just be done with it. Because it does seem like many of these countries have zero interest in actually looking at the historical makeup and why Israel is divided in the way that it is.
יש לי מסר ברור לאותם מנהיגים שמכירים במדינה פלסטינית לאחר הטבח הנורא ב7 באוקטובר. אתם מעניקים פרס עצום לטרור. ויש לי מסר נוסף עבורכם. זה לא יהיה. לא תקום מדינה פלסטינית ממערב לירדן. במשך שנים אני מנעתי את הקמתה של מדינת טרור זו מול לחצים אדירים, גם מבית וגם מן החוץ. עשינו זאת בנחישות ועשינו זאת בתבונה מדינית. לא כל שכן. הכפלנו את ההתיישבות היהודית ביהודה ושומרון ונמשיך בדרך זו. המענה לניסיון האחרון לכפות עלינו מדינת טרור בלב ארצנו, המענה הזה יינתן לאחר שובי מארצות הברית. תמתינו.
In any case, do let me know what you think of the scenario in the comment section below. Is Ramaphosa just on some crazy juju? And will this be negative towards South Africa? So let's actually quickly get on then to the main topics of today, and that's in relation to the South African news. So the first news article is around the impact on South African smelters, specifically with the rising cost of energy that rose by 800% since 2007. Now, out of the original 45 furnaces, only 2 remain active, and both of those are currently threatening collapse because they're saying that it's unsustainable to power the smelters given the rising cost of electricity. Now, the government is considering special load tariffs to save the industry, which actually employs around 300,000 jobs, in a move to compete with China. Now, that whole China competition thing, that's also becoming important. Because in other news, China's exports have surged after Donald Trump's tariffs. Now, this is despite US tariffs being as high as 145% on Chinese goods. Now, China has rerouted its exports and are now hitting a record trade surplus. But they've actually rerouted their exports to India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, who are all now major buyers of, well, cheap Chinese-made junk, with South Africa actively welcoming Chinese investment rather than imposing tariffs. Now, that in itself is all important because many of these countries are now seeing their countries being dumped with Chinese cheap goods. And this is meaning that many of these countries are starting to talk about protectivism in their own right. Now, this is important because one of the things that Ramaphosa recently said is that he talked against, as did China, against potential protectivism of the national state. And so they effectively said that they wanted to adopt a position where policies wouldn't protect a state's economic interests, but rather would work as a global collective. Now, the idea was supposed to be that Donald Trump wouldn't be able to impose trade tariffs under the guise of protecting US trade and rather should work within the global sphere. Well, now that policy shift is now being applied to China, which is allowing China to destroy many countries' local manufacturing bases by flooding those markets with cheap Chinese junk. Now, in other news, Business Unity South Africa, the BUSA, has taken the South African government to court, calling the new employment equity targets as being unworkable and reckless, and argues that they undermine transformation by setting unrealistic quotas. You can let me know what you think of that in the comment section below, but it's nice to see that they've finally come to the fight as well. Now, in terms of AGOA, the US-Africa trade deal AGOA, which is critical for South African exports, faces expiry at the end of this month. And according to the latest news, there's not been a peep from Washington about, well, anything in relation to it. So there's been no attempts to renew it. There's been no attempts to negotiate it. They haven't even discussed AGOA. And this is going to threaten jobs, investments, and foreign currency inflows. And apparently nobody's doing anything about it because that's the ANC way. Now, in other news, the EFF has called to remove all Afrikaner statues. That's statues of Kruger, Botha, and Van Riebeck, all of which the EFF were classing as colonial symbols. Now, the EFF have pushed a private members bill in Parliament to have all Afrikaner statues around the country removed because apparently there are signs of Afrikaner repression of the black majority. Now, AfriForum have slammed the motion as an attack on rights and an erasure of the Afrikaans identity and an attempt to rewrite history. You can let me know what you think of that in the comment section below. Now, recently you would have noticed that Cyril Ramaphosa said that the best governance in the country is done by the DA. Well, following Ramaphosa's surprising praise for the DA municipality, the DA reports that they gained over 100 new members in Khayelitsha, Cape Town. Now, for those of you who don't know, well, Khayelitsha is typically an ANC ward, and like an ANC ward by like miles. Now, residents in that ward are citing ANC neglect and service delivery failures. Now, the ANC has hit back, saying the DA neglects black townships, and you recently saw this in my video from yesterday, where the ANC Youth League says they govern better because they look after townships, and the DA doesn't. In other news, Kenny Kunene, who was suspended following the murder allegations, has been cleared of wrongdoing. Now, ultimately, what that means is that Kenny Kunene has been cleared to return back to the PA as being an exonerated member. And you say what you want around the PA, but the minute that Kenny Kunene was found at home with a murder suspect, he immediately resigned and waited for the process to conclude. Once the process concluded, he's now been able to celebrate and return back to office. And if only all ANC members were the same, the wheels of justice might turn a bit quicker because they might want to actually get the things concluded. And ultimately, we may have a little bit more trust in politicians. But I will say, regardless of what you think about the Sushi King, at least the Sushi King had some morals in this instance. And actually, between him and Gates and McKenzie, they actually waited for the process to conclude before making any form of political move. So congratulations, Kenny. So anyway, let's move on to the final news article that the SACP plans to contest the 2026 elections independently after 22 years of failed alliance talks. This is what they say. So they've been talking about the reconfiguration of the ANC alliance for like 22 years. The ANC never take them seriously, and so they are now splitting. Now, the ANC has downplayed that split, but dual members are uneasy about loyalty and voter splitting, with the two parties canvassing the electorate independently. How can you be parts of each other if you're both acting independently with your own policy and your own political dogma? Well, you can't really. And so many individuals are saying, whilst the ANC is downplaying a potential alliance split, the split is occurring nonetheless. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's the news of the day. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.